Welcome back to the deep dive. When you hear the name Karl Marx, you probably think of, well, economic history, right? Maybe revolution or just a critique of capitalism.
That's the standard picture, yeah.
But today, we're doing something a bit different. We're setting aside Marx the prophet, Marx the predictor of history, and focusing on Marx the philosopher.
Marx is a serious, compelling, normative political theorist.
Exactly. And our mission for you, the listener, is really to shortcut your access to some pretty complex debates within what's called analytical Marxism.
Yeah, it's a fascinating field.
We want to move beyond just asking if socialism was inevitable, historically speaking, and ask the big moral question. Is socialism, or communism for that matter, actually morally desirable?
Is it better? Is it more free, more just? Does it help people flourish more than, say, liberal capitalism? Those are the questions.
And what really pushed this whole way of thinking, this normative turn?
Well, a big part of it was the pressure Marxists felt after the collapse of Eastern European socialism. That was a huge moment.
Because the inevitability argument wasn't looking so good anymore.
Not at all. They suddenly realized, you can't just rely on historical determinism. You actually need to convince people, convince citizens, that the socialist alternative is morally superior.
You need an argument for why it's good, not just why it's coming.
Precisely. And that whole shift, that need for a moral case, really defined this analytical Marxist project. But that immediately runs into a core tension.
Okay, what's the tension?
Well, historically, Marxists had a relatively easy target. They could attack traditional liberal justice as being merely formal.
You mean like focusing on voting rights or legal equality, but ignoring the huge economic gaps?
Exactly. Ignoring massive material inequality.
Yeah.
But modern liberal egalitarianism, especially people like John Rawls, maybe Ronald Dworkin,
Yeah.
that's much harder to attack.
Because they do care about material equality.
Very much so. Think about Rawls' difference principle. The whole idea is to arrange society so that it maximizes the condition of the least advantaged group. It's a powerful argument for material equality, built right into the framework of justice.
So if you're a Marxist trying to critique liberalism on grounds of justice, Rawls makes it much harder. You can't just say liberals ignore the poor anymore.
Right. It's a much more robust defense of a certain kind of distributive justice. So you can't easily win that distribution fight. Modern Marxists had to find different ground.
Which led them down, as you see it, two main interpretive paths for reading Marx's normative claims, his sort of moral argument.
That's right. Two big paths emerged. The first one, let's call it P1, is kind of the classic and maybe more radical view. Communism is beyond justice.
Meaning, we won't even need justice anymore.
That's the idea, that a truly developed good society, one with material abundance and social harmony, would actually eliminate the need for these sort of remedial principles like justice. The circumstances that make justice necessary would just disappear.
Okay, that's a big claim. What's the second path, P2?
P2 argues pretty much the opposite. Socialism or communism is about realizing true justice. The argument here is that capitalism isn't just flawed, it's fundamentally and institutionally unjust.
Because of?
Because of exploitation, because of alienation. And only major structural reform, maybe even revolution, can fix these fundamental injustices and achieve real justice.
So one path says justice becomes obsolete, the other says socialism fulfills justice. Two very different takes.
Very different. And before we really dive into exploring those two paths, we just have to kind of lay the groundwork, acknowledge the intellectual framework Marx himself operated in.
Because his whole view of things like justice and rights was shaped by his deeper theories.
Absolutely. You can't really understand his take on justice without understanding his methodological premises. Two key ones. First, historical materialism.
The idea that the economic base, how you produce things, who owns what determines the superstructure.
Right. The base determines the superstructure, and that superstructure includes things like law, politics, culture, and crucially for us, concepts of justice and rights.
So for Marx, ideas about justice aren't timeless truths. They're products of a specific time and economic system.
Exactly. They have historical and class-specific characteristics. What counts as just in feudalism is different from capitalism, which might be different again in communism.
Okay, and the second premise?
That's ideology critique. This is the idea that, especially within a capitalist context, the very language we use terms like justice, freedom, rights, often functions ideologically.
Meaning it serves the interests of the dominant class. It masks what's really going on.
Yeah, it can mask underlying class conflicts, legitimize existing property relations, make the status quo seem natural or fair when maybe it isn't.
Which explains why Marx himself was often pretty skeptical, even dismissive, of appealing to justice as some kind of independent, objective standard.
Right. He suspected it was usually just bourgeois ideology dressed up. This contrasts really sharply with the liberal tradition, say from Hume to Rawls, who see justice as a necessary, practical solution to the problem of coordinating society and resolving conflicts.
Okay, framework established. Let's unpack that first path, P1, the really utopian one, communism as beyond justice. To get why a Marxist might think this, we first need to understand the standard liberal view of why we need justice in the first place.
Right. And that standard view, which you find in David Hume and, yeah, much more formally in John Rawls, it centers on what they call the circumstances of justice.
The conditions that make justice both possible and necessary.
Exactly. And they usually break it down into two categories. First, there are the objective conditions, the main one being moderate scarcity.
Meaning resources aren't infinitely abundant, but we're not in a total war of all against all either. There's enough to cooperate over, but not enough for everyone to have everything they could possibly want.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the subjective conditions. The key one here is limited altruism, or sometimes called limited reciprocity.
People aren't perfectly selfish, but they're not perfectly selfless either. We care about ourselves, our families, maybe our friends, but our benevolence doesn't typically extend equally to everyone.
Exactly. We have our own interests, our own plans. So, given moderate scarcity and limited altruism, you get conflicts. Conflicts over resources, conflicts over goals.
And the function of justice, in this standard view, is basically to deal with those conflicts.
Yes, it's seen as a remedial virtue. It's not necessarily the highest virtue, like benevolence might be, but it's essential for coordinating cooperation and settling disputes fairly when resources are limited and our goodwill isn't infinite. It's the rulebook we need when just wanting the best for everyone isn't enough to solve disagreements.
Okay, so that's the standard liberal picture. Now, how does the Marxist beyond justice argument try to dismantle this?
Well, the first move is to attack the idea that these circumstances of justice are permanent, eternal features of the human condition.
They say, no, these aren't constants, they're historical products.
Exactly. They argue that the specific kind of scarcity we see and the specific kinds of conflicts and limited altruism we experience are deeply rooted in the structure of capitalism, particularly its class divisions and its inherent drive for accumulation, which can create artificial scarcity.
So change the system, change the circumstances.
That's the core logic. The historical task of capitalism, ironically for Marx, was to develop the productive forces, technology, industry to an unprecedented degree.
To create the potential for abundance.
Right, to lay the material foundation for the communist principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. If you achieve genuine material abundance, the argument goes, the objective condition, moderate scarcity, disappears. There's enough for everyone's needs.
Okay, so abundance tackles the objective condition. What about the subjective one, the limited altruism and conflict?
Well, the argument there is that the abolition of private ownership of the means of production and the resulting disappearance of class divisions and class conflict will fundamentally change human relationships.
We'll become less selfish, more cooperative.
The idea is that without the systemic competition fostered by capitalism, without the antagonism between owners and workers, the need for adversarial rules like rights and justice will just wither away. The model is often compared to an idealized family.
Where people just look out for each other out of love and harmony, not because they're calculating rights and duties.
Kind of. Needs are met spontaneously out of a sense of community and shared purpose, not through legalistic claims. Justice, as a system of adjudication between conflicting claims, becomes redundant.
It sounds, well, utopian. And philosophers like Kymlicka have raised some pretty serious objections, haven't they?
Oh, definitely. Their critique of this beyond justice view is quite strong. Kymlicka points out several things. First, even if you achieve incredible material abundance, some forms of scarcity seem structural. They don't just vanish.
Like what?
He talks about positional scarcity, or positional goods. Think about things like the best university degrees, the top leadership positions in any field, maybe the most desirable houses in the nicest locations.
You can't just make everyone CEO or give everyone a beachfront mansion.
Exactly. Even with vast material wealth, these things are inherently scarce. Their value often depends on the fact that not everyone can have them. And allocating these positional goods fairly still seems to require principles of justice. You need rules for who gets the corner office or the professorship.
Okay, positional goods are one problem. What else?
Perhaps even more fundamental is the problem of value pluralism and moral disagreement. Let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that we do eliminate class conflict and achieve material abundance.
A big if, but okay.
Even then, people will still disagree about fundamental values, won't they? They'll have different religious beliefs, different moral outlooks, different ideas about the good life.
Different views on, say, environmental protection versus economic development or individual liberty versus community needs.
Precisely. And these deep disagreements about values and priorities will inevitably lead to conflicts. How do you resolve those conflicts fairly if you've supposedly gone beyond justice? You still need objective, fair principles and procedures to adjudicate these competing claims.
So you need justice principles even without scarcity or class conflict, just because people reasonably disagree about what's important.
That seems right. Justice isn't just about dividing up scarce resources. It's also about respecting persons, navigating disagreement fairly, and establishing legitimate ways to make collective decisions when values clash.
So the conclusion here is,
The conclusion is that this idea of a complete transcendence of justice is pretty much philosophically indefensible, especially in a complex modern society. Justice isn't somehow incompatible with positive virtues like love or generosity or solidarity.
it's more like a backstop.
Exactly. It acts as a necessary standard, a framework to guide our actions and resolve conflicts when inevitably the demands of love or need or different values pull in different directions. As someone said, without justice, even charity can become helpless or arbitrary. You need principles.
Okay, so path one, beyond justice, seems like a dead end, or at least highly problematic. That brings us to path two, the idea that capitalism is fundamentally unjust, and socialism aims to realize true justice.
Right, and this is arguably the more influential and analytically robust way of reading Marx normatively today.
And this critique generally follows two main lines, though they're often connected: exploitation and alienation. Let's tackle exploitation first. That sounds very classically Marxist.
It is, and the classic Marxist schema, the one you find most clearly in Capital, Volume 1, is quite technical. It's based heavily on the labor theory of value, LTV.
Can you give us the nutshell version?
Sure. The basic idea is that the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Labor power itself, the worker's ability to work, is also a commodity, bought and sold on the market.
And its value is determined by the labor time needed to keep the worker alive and able to work: food, shelter, etc.
Right. The worker gets paid the value of their labor power, say, in wages that cover their subsistence. And here's the crucial part, the worker, during their workday, produces more value than the value of their own labor power.
They work longer than is necessary to cover their own cost.
Exactly. That extra unpaid labor time generates surplus value, which the capitalist appropriates as profit.
So the intuitive normative conclusion is pretty straightforward. Capitalist profit fundamentally relies on extracting this unpaid labor, this surplus value, from the workers. It's systematic taking.
That's a classic picture of exploitation. It's rooted in the production process itself.
But, as we mentioned, the labor theory of value itself is, well, let's just say it's heavily contested in modern economics. Most economists think prices are determined by supply and demand, marginal utility, and not just labor time.
Absolutely. The LTV faces significant theoretical challenges. If price and value diverge significantly, the LTV's ability to explain the actual workings of a capitalist economy, including profit generation, becomes questionable.
So if the technical LTV foundation is shaky, does the whole Marxist critique of exploitation just collapse?
Not necessarily. And this is where the analytical Marxists performed a really crucial reconstruction of the argument. Thinkers like G.A. Cohen and later John Romer worked to redefine exploitation in a way that didn't depend strictly on the LTV.
How do they do that? What's the core idea if it's not surplus value?
Well, G.A. Cohen, for instance, shifted the focus dramatically. He argued that the injustice of exploitation isn't really about whether the exchange between the worker and capitalist is equal in some technical LTV sense at the moment of the wage bargain.
It's not about calculating surplus value minute by minute.
No. For Cohen, the fundamental injustice lies in the background conditions, the background institutions under which that exchange takes place.
Meaning the fact that the capitalist owns the factory, the tools, the means of production, and the worker owns, Well, it's just their ability to work.
Precisely. The injustice stems from the massively unequal initial ownership of productive assets. This inequality puts the worker in a position where they are forced to sell their labor power to the capitalist simply to survive. It looks like a free agreement, but it's what Cohen called compelled voluntariness.
You're free to choose which capitalist exploits you or to starve.
Basically, yes. The exploitation, the unfairness, derives from this fundamental inequality in assets and power before any work even begins.
And John Romer took this even further analytically.
Romer developed formal models of exploitation that completely bypassed the LTV. He defined exploitation in terms of unequal initial endowments, who starts with what, and the resulting feasible alternatives available to different groups.
So even in a perfectly competitive market with seemingly voluntary exchanges, if the underlying property structure is unjust, one group can systematically benefit at the expense of another.
That's exactly his point. Exploitation, in Romer's models, is a symptom of an unjust distribution of initial assets and opportunities. The root problem isn't the exchange itself, but the institutional ownership and power structure that shapes those exchanges.
This seems like a really significant shift. It moves the critique away from the technicalities of LTV towards broader questions of institutional justice, ownership, and power.
It is a major move, and it allows this reconstructed Marxist critique to engage directly with other political theories, like, say, libertarianism.
How so? Because libertarians like Robert Nozick put enormous emphasis on voluntary exchange and historical entitlement. If you acquired your property justly and people voluntarily agree to work for you, where's the injustice?
Right. Nozick focuses on the process. The Cohen-Romer Marxist response is to say, hold on, we need to look at the justice of the starting point. How did that initial distribution of property come about? Is the background structure fair? They shift the focus from the process of exchange back to the justice of the underlying social basic structure, the distribution of ownership, power, and opportunities. If that structure is inherently unfair, then the voluntary exchanges happening within it are tainted.
It also seems this reconstruction addresses some old problems with the LTV definition of exploitation.
It does. The traditional definition focused solely on the extraction of surplus value from productive workers. Cohen pointed out this was paradoxically both too strong and too weak.
How so?
Too strong because, taken literally, it might condemn things we generally think are just, like taxing workers' surplus to fund welfare programs for the disabled or elderly who aren't producing surplus value. That looks like forced transfer too, technically.
Okay, and too weak.
Too weak because it ignored many people who suffer greatly under capitalism but aren't directly exploited in the technical sense. Think of the long-term unemployed or historically married women legally barred from many jobs or marginalized groups facing discrimination. They aren't having surplus value extracted, but they are clearly victims of the system's injustices.
So by shifting the focus to background institutional unfairness, unequal ownership, lack of real opportunity, the exploitation critique becomes broader and perhaps more morally compelling.
Exactly. The normative core becomes an indictment of background institutional unfairness. And interestingly, this brings the Marxist critique much closer to the concerns of liberal egalitarians like Rawls, who also emphasize the justice of the basic structure of society. Exploitation becomes less a unique, standalone injustice and more a predictable consequence of deeper distributional injustice, particularly the unequal ownership of productive assets.
Okay, that's a really helpful clarification of the modern exploitation critique. Let's move to the second major line of attack, alienation. This feels different. Deeper, maybe? Less about distribution, more about the human experience of work itself.
It is different, and arguably it taps into something even more fundamental. It goes right back to the early Marx, especially his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844.
Where he talks about the 4 aspects of alienation under capitalism.
That's right. It's a powerful framework. First, alienation from the product of labor. The thing you make doesn't belong to you. It confronts you as something alien, even hostile, controlling your life.
Like working on an assembly line, making a car you could never afford, and the demands of producing that car dictate your every move.
Exactly. Second, alienation from the labor process itself. Work isn't a fulfilling, voluntary expression of your creativity. It's forced, external, something you do just to survive. It's often repetitive, mindless, dictated by the machine or the boss. It's not your activity.
Okay, product and process. What's the third?
This is arguably the deepest alienation from our species being. Gattungswesen. This is Marx's term for our essential human nature, which he saw as involving free, conscious, creative activity. Under capitalism, he argued, our distinctively human capacity for creative labor is suppressed. Work is reduced to a mere means to physical survival, like an animal activity, rather than an end in itself, an expression of our humanity.
We work to live rather than living to work in a fulfilling sense.
Right. And the fourth aspect follows from the others: alienation from other people. If work is just a means to an end, and everyone is forced into competition for jobs and resources, relationships become instrumentalized. We see others as competitors or just as means to our own ends, rather than as fellow humans in a shared community. Universal competition replaces cooperation.
That's the early Marx. Did the concept evolve in his later work?
It did. While the term alienation became less frequent, the underlying themes definitely persisted and were developed. Think about his analysis of commodity fetishism in Capital.
Where market relationships obscure the real human relationships underneath.
Exactly. We relate to products, to money, as if they have inherent power, forgetting that their value comes from human labor and social relations. That's a form of cognitive alienation. And his analysis of the division of labor and machine industry constantly highlights how these systems fragment tasks, de-skill workers, and impose a rhythm that crushes autonomy and meaning.
So the core concern about work being dehumanizing, meaningless, externally controlled, that remains central even if the terminology shifts slightly.
Absolutely. And the crucial insight here, especially relevant for comparing Marx with, say, welfare state capitalism, is this. Even if you improve wages, even if you achieve better distribution of income, even if exploitation in the narrow sense is reduced.
The fundamental problem of meaningless work, of alienation, might still persist.
Precisely. Improving wages doesn't automatically restore meaning or autonomy to the work itself. You can have well-paid alienation.
This raises some really tricky philosophical issues, though, doesn't it? When Marx talks about species being and creative labor, is he smuggling in a particular view of the good life?
That's a major challenge. Critics argue this sounds like perfectionism, the state promoting a specific vision of human flourishing, i.e., creative labor as the ideal. And that potentially conflicts with the liberal principle of neutrality, the idea that the state shouldn't dictate what constitutes a valuable life. What if someone prefers leisure or simple routine work over intense creative engagement?
Is the state then justified in pushing them towards non-alienated work? It feels paternalistic.
It does raise that question. And there's also the eliminability question. Is it genuinely possible, technologically and organizationally, in a complex modern economy, to universally transform all necessary labor, including the repetitive or unpleasant tasks, into fulfilling autonomous creative activity? Or is some level of alienation, some trade-off, inevitable?
And what are the institutional implications? If alienation is the problem, what's the solution? It seems different from just redistributing wealth.
It is. The critique of alienation fundamentally shifts the focus. It moves our attention from what is given the distribution of goods and income towards how we produce and how we govern the production process itself.
So it points towards things like production democracy, worker self-management, giving people more control over their immediate work environment and the goals of their enterprise.
Exactly. It opens up the whole domain of workplace governance and the organization of production as sites of justice and injustice, not just distribution. Though again, you hit trade-offs. Maybe 4 hours of deeply engaging, non-alienated work is possible, but what if people would prefer 2 hours of boring work plus 2 extra hours of free time for tenants or family? How do you balance those values?
Okay, so we have these two powerful critiques. Exploitation, rooted in unjust background structures, and alienation, rooted in the experience and meaning of work itself. If these are the problems with capitalism, what about the alternatives? We have to start by acknowledging the failures of the 20th century, right?
We absolutely must. The historical experience of central planning in the Soviet Union and elsewhere provides crucial and largely negative lessons. Its failures basically boiled down to a dual problem.
Which were?
First, the knowledge problem, famously articulated by economists like Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek. The argument is that the specific, local, often tacit, and constantly changing knowledge needed to run an economy efficiently is dispersed among millions of individuals. No central planning board, no matter how powerful its computers, can possibly gather and process all that information effectively.
Markets through the price system are argued to be much better at coordinating that dispersed knowledge.
That's the Hayekian argument, yes.
Yeah.
Prices act as signals, conveying information about scarcity and demand that guides individual decisions in a decentralized way. Central planning lacks that dynamic signaling mechanism.
Okay, knowledge problem. What was the second issue?
The incentive scarcity problem. Without market competition, without the signals of profit and loss, without clear links between effort, innovation, and reward, Centrally planned economies struggled massively with motivating efficiency, quality, and innovation.
Bureaucracy tended to replace entrepreneurialism.
Often, yes. Combining both intrinsic motivation, pride in work, and extrinsic motivation, rewards, competition, effectively proved very difficult. So the conclusion from this historical experience, for most analysts, is that comprehensive top-down central planning is simply unfeasible and undesirable. It doesn't work well economically and often comes with severe political downsides too.
Which pushes anyone thinking about socialist alternatives towards models that try to combine social ownership or control with market mechanisms.
Exactly. And that leads us directly to concepts like market socialism and related ideas like worker self-management.
What's the basic idea there? How do you combine those seemingly contradictory elements?
The core goal is to find a workable compromise, a balance between efficiency, which market coordination seems good at, and justice, specifically tackling exploitation and alienation through democratizing ownership and governance.
So how might it work in practice? What are the key features?
Well, there are various models, but typically they involve some form of public or social ownership of the major means of production. So, capital isn't primarily in private hands. But crucially, individual firms still operate within a market environment, competing with each other, responding to market prices, aiming for efficiency.
So you keep the market for goods and services, but change who owns the firms.
Yes, and often a key component is implementing employee participation and self-management at the enterprise level. Workers would have significant say, maybe even control, over the decisions made within their own firms, how work is organized, what investments are made, how profits are distributed.
And the normative appeal is clear, addressing both exploitation and alienation.
That's the hope. By changing the ownership structure, you tackle the root of exploitation, identified by Cohen and Romer, the unequal background distribution of productive assets. And by introducing workplace democracy and self-management, you directly address the problem of alienation, giving workers more autonomy, control, and potentially more meaning in their work.
It sounds appealing in theory. How is it fared in practice? Have there been successful examples?
There have been various historical attempts and experiments, like the former Yugoslavia system or the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain. The record is mixed, frankly. Some studies show worker-managed firms can be quite efficient, others point to challenges.
Nice.
Issues like difficulties in raising capital, if profits are mostly distributed to workers, potential underinvestment, challenges in decision-making processes, governance costs, and sometimes the emergence of new inequalities between workers in successful versus unsuccessful firms. But even with those limitations, market socialism provides a much deeper institutional imagination for tackling that dual problem of distribution and production compared to just tweaking capitalism at the margins.
Which brings us to the other major alternative often discussed, social democracy. How does that compare? It seems much less radical.
It is much less radical, institutionally speaking. Social democracy essentially accepts the basic framework of private property and market economies. It doesn't fundamentally challenge who owns the means of production.
So what does it do?
It aims to correct or mitigate the worst consequences of the market through state intervention after the fact. Think progressive taxation, strong social safety nets, unemployment insurance, pensions, healthcare, labor regulations, minimum wage, working conditions, robust public services. It's essentially using the state to redistribute wealth and provide social security within a broadly capitalist system.
It's often described as an end-of-pipe correction, right? Fixing problems after they emerge from the market system.
That's a good way to put it. Normatively, social democracy aligns much more closely with Rawlsian liberal egalitarianism. It focuses on achieving greater social equality, ensuring everyone has basic security, opportunity, and equal standing as citizens, rather than fundamentally restructuring ownership or production.
And its limitation, from a Marxist perspective?
The main limitation is that it offers a relatively weak or indirect response to the core problems of alienation and production democracy. It primarily operates on the distribution end, leaving the fundamental power dynamics and potential meaninglessness within the capitalist workplace largely untouched.
This really forces us back to that comparison with Rawls, doesn't it? Because there's quite a bit of overlap, surprisingly, perhaps.
There is significant convergence, especially when you look beyond just the difference principle. Both Rawls and the reconstructed Marxist critiques share a deep institutional approach. They both agree that justice isn't just about individual acts or outcomes, but about the fairness of the social basic structure, the fundamental rules and institutions governing society.
And Rawls himself, especially later in his work, talked about alternatives to welfare state capitalism.
Exactly. He contrasted the welfare state, which he saw as merely corrective, with what he called a property-owning democracy, POD.
What's the idea behind POD?
The goal of POD is not just to redistribute income at the end, but to ensure a wide diffusion of ownership of capital and productive assets throughout the entire population from the beginning. The aim is to prevent the concentration of wealth and power that undermines fair equality of opportunity and political equality.
So things like supporting small businesses, worker cooperatives, wider access to education and skills, maybe even stakeholder grants or universal basic capital.
Yes, policies aimed at empowering everyone to be active participants in the economy, not just wage laborers dependent on a small class of capital owners. And when you look at POD, it starts to blur the lines quite significantly with some forms of moderate democratic socialism that also aim for broader social ownership within a market framework.
So Rawlschian liberalism, at least in its POD variant, might go quite far in addressing the exploitation critique by tackling the background inequality in ownership.
It certainly moves in that direction, much further than traditional welfare states. But the divergence remains, and it centers squarely on that issue of alienation.
Rawls doesn't have much to say about the meaning of work or democracy within the firm.
Relatively little. His focus remains primarily on the justice of the background structure in terms of distribution of rights, opportunities, income, and wealth. The internal life of the firm, the experience of work itself, the questions of meaning, autonomy, and community at work, these remain largely outside his primary focus.
And that's precisely the gap that the Marxist critique of alienation highlights, and where market socialists argue we need to go further than even property-owning democracy.
Exactly. That remains the key point of contention and the major thematic contribution that the alienation critique brings to the table, pushing beyond even sophisticated liberal egalitarianism.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this in a dialogue with the other major perspectives. We already touched on libertarianism with Nozick. The core clash there is about...
It's about the legitimacy, the starting point, and the nature of voluntary exchange. Nozick emphasizes historical entitlement and voluntary contracts.
If you didn't steal it, and people freely agree to interact with you, it's just...
The Marx-Cohen-Romer response is to interrogate that notion of voluntary by placing it within its institutional context. They force us to examine the justice of the initial distribution of property and power. They introduce the concept of compelled freedom. Workers might choose to accept a job, but that choice is made under conditions of duress, shaped by an unjust lack of alternatives due to unequal ownership of productive means. The background structure constrains the choices.
And the dialogue with liberal egalitarianism, like Rawls.
There's significant convergence, as we saw. Rawls' principles, particularly the difference principle and fair equality of opportunity, provide a powerful normative framework that can justify substantial institutional restructuring to combat the unfairness underlying exploitation. Property-owning democracy is one such potential outcome.
But the divergence remains sharpest on
alienation and production democracy. Liberal egalitarianism, even in its most robust forms, generally lacks a systematic account of, or institutional remedies for, the potential meaninglessness or lack of autonomy in work itself. How to integrate concerns about meaning, self-realization, and democratic governance within the economic sphere remains a largely open question for liberalism, and it's the central, unresolved issue highlighted by the Marxist tradition.
Looking at the bigger picture, the political context has changed dramatically since Marx's time, or even since the mid-20th century.
Undeniably, we've seen a significant retreat of the political movement dimension associated with classical Marxism.
Why love it?
Several factors. Structural changes in the Western working class deindustrialization, the rise of the service sector, increased fragmentation, the political landscape shifted, and of course the manifest failures and eventual collapse of actually existing socialism in the Soviet bloc massively weakened the appeal of comprehensive, revolutionary alternatives.
So Marxism became less of a mass political project and more
of an academic one, particularly with analytical Marxism. The battlefield largely shifted into universities, into journals, into philosophical debate. The goal became refining intellectually defensible, normatively compelling versions of the critiques of exploitation, class, and injustice, and sketching plausible institutional alternatives rather than mobilizing for revolution.
This also highlights a potential theory-practice gap, doesn't it?
It can, yes.
Yeah.
Traditional Marxist theory, especially the exploitation critique, is very producer-centric. It focuses on the worker whose surplus value is extracted. But many contemporary progressive movements champion the cause of groups who aren't necessarily exploited in that specific sense. Like marginalized racial or ethnic minorities facing discrimination, people with disabilities needing support, the elderly single mothers. Their claims are often based more on principles of need, equality, inclusion, or rectifying exclusion, rather than directly on being exploited producers.
So Marxist practice often supports broad distributive equality and inclusion for these groups.
But the theoretical grounding for this, within a purely exploitation-focused framework, can sometimes be a bit awkward. It occasionally seems to conflict with the strong emphasis on self-ownership that's arguably implicit in the idea that having your surplus value taken is the core injustice. It creates tensions.
So wrapping up, what's the enduring legacy, the contemporary relevance of engaging with Marx as a normative theorist?
I think it remains incredibly potent. First, Marx provides a persistent challenge to liberalism, constantly forcing us to confront the gap, the tension between formal equality, equal rights on paper, and deep-seated structural inequality in power, wealth, and opportunity.
It keeps the focus on the background institutions.
Yes, and it leaves us with two indispensable diagnostic tools for analyzing contemporary society. First, the critique of exploitation, even in its reconstructed form, forces us to scrutinize ownership structures, background institutions, and power dynamics. It connects distributive justice directly to class structure and the control of productive resources.
And the second tool.
The critique of alienation. This insists on bringing the quality of work, the meaning of labor, issues of autonomy, creativity, and workplace governance squarely into the normative agenda. It reminds us that human flourishing isn't just about what we get, distribution, but also about what we do and how we relate to each other in the process of production.
So the core problem remains unresolved.
In many ways, yes. The central challenge, still very much alive today, is finding the right institutional mix for a modern, complex, perhaps post-industrial society that can simultaneously achieve efficiency, freedom, equality, and meaningful work. How do we balance the necessary end-of-pipe welfare corrections of social democracy with the deeper structural changes to property and governance suggested by market socialism or property-owning democracy? That remains the crucial contested terrain.
It really forces us to look beyond just the outcomes, the distribution of stuff, to how we actually organize our economic life, how we produce, how we govern work itself.
That's the fundamental shift in perspective that the alienation critique in particular demands.
We're left weighing these big institutional choices. Is the best feasible path the social democratic one, primarily correcting outcomes? Or does a just society require those deeper structural changes to ownership and workplace governance, and suggested by market socialists or maybe even POD advocates?
And that leads us to one final provocative thought for you, the listener, to wrestle with. If we accept the argument, coming from analytical egalitarians like Romer or Dworkin, that some inequality in outcomes, even in resource ownership, could potentially arise legitimately from people's different choices about risk, effort, saving versus consumption, leisure versus work, even starting from a just baseline. Does that possibility undermine the moral case for universal social ownership of the means of production? If inequality can arise justly through choice, do we still need to socialize everything? Or, perhaps, does it simply mean we need to redefine the constraints necessary for market interactions and private ownership to be considered truly just and non-exploitative? Maybe the debate isn't ultimately about whether we need justice in property relations, but about exactly what kind of property structures justice truly demands in a world of diverse choices and values.
A really profound question to leave us with. It shifts the ground again, doesn't it? Something to definitely mull over as you think about your own work, your own life, and how these big ideas of alienation, exploitation, and self-determination play out. Thanks for diving deep with us today.